So groovy girlies, thank you so much for joining me back again on my channel, and we have a little bit of a different series that is going to be coming to the channel, which really requires your guys' fullest of attention, and it's not going to be the happiest and most upbeat of videos because the stuff we're talking about is real life and it is very serious. But hopefully these videos can be educational to you guys, because honestly doing all this research has taught me so much, and it just should be common knowledge at this point. Like, everyone should know the real history of Britain, and a lot of people don't because we don't get taught these in school. Instead we get a whitewash version or a history that paints white people out to be good, and obviously they're not going to talk to us about slavery that much because white people are literal pieces of shit for that. So I'm not going to play dumb, okay? We all know that slavery was a thing, but we don't know the history of it at all. We don't know when it started. We don't really know what it involved. A lot of us don't even know what colonialism is. Our country was literally built on it. We tore down other countries for the benefit of our own country. We killed and murdered and abused people for the benefit of our own country. So I'd like to introduce you to a series called What We Should Have Been Taught in School. This is going to cover so many different topics, mainly to do with Black history, but I really do want to go down loads of other different avenues regarding all people of colour and the history that we just should know. But today's video and the up and coming videos are all going to be based around the actual British Black history. I am going to be diving into a little bit of American history as well, just to make it all make sense. But sadly all countries are involved in this. It wasn't just a one party situation, but the English are mainly to blame. So the thing that irks me the most is the other day I was watching a video that went viral of some white supremacists in Hertfordshire. I believe it was on the 9th of this month. They turned up at a Black Lives Matter protest to retaliate with the protesters, to antagonise them. And you can hear these white supremacists say, go back to your own country, go back to Africa. It's actually so ironic and it's a laughable concept because Africans were here before the British even were. And I'm going to be honest, I didn't even know that fact until about a month ago when I started doing some actual research. Then again, I would never say that because they're British citizens and they were born here, but also it's just downright racist. Anyway, let's give some context so I can actually teach you and we can all learn together, because holding my hands up, I didn't know half this shit before either. So a few Africans were actually a part of the Roman Imperial Army, and they occupied the southern part of our island, so the UK, for around 3.5 centuries, which is a long ass fucking time. They were here to defend Hadrian's Wall, which we now know as Carlisle. I was born in Carlisle but made in the Royal Navy in the 3rd century AD. Do you know how long ago that was? But they were actually raised in North Africa. The earliest recorded date of this unit's presence in Britannia, which is what it was called at the time, was 233 to 238. However, to add on top of that, an African soldier is actually to have been recorded reaching Britain by about 210. So I actually discovered this information from Peter Fry's Staying Power book, which was published in 1984, and I cannot recommend you guys enough to read this book. It quite literally depicts the whole timeline of Black British history, and it's just such a good read. A lot of books such as Black and British, which I also recommend you to read, has been heavily influenced by this book, and it's taught so many people so much about the hidden history that schools refuse to teach you. So do get your hands on it. If you are struggling to find it, I actually found a Google document with it all on if you do want to have a read, so just feel free to message me on Instagram. I can send that to you. So a quick statistic for you is actually estimated that 3.1 million Africans were transported to the British colonies from North America, South America and the Caribbean, but sadly only 2.7 million of them even arrived. The conditions that they would put these people through were horrific, to the point that people would die along the way. A lot of them were murdered, some couldn't handle the conditions as expected and would sadly pass away, and this included mothers, children, brothers, fathers, elderly. There was sadly no one that slave traders and capturers would show mercy for. So although the first recorded Englishman to take slaves from Africa and bring them to Britain was actually John Locke in 1555, there was actually borrowed slaves here way before that, and by borrowed I mean people who were working for free. So there was a black musician living in London, and he was employed by Henry VII and then further his successor Henry VIII. However, it's honestly so uncertain whether he came from Africa, Scotland, Portugal, Spain. There's so many realms that he could have came from. And also, just a little side note, if you do want to learn about the Black Scottish history, then I really recommend Peter Fry's book. Sadly his name is unknown, but he's referred to as John Blank or John Blanca, which translates to John White. The fucking irony, man. It's such a horrible ironic joke, and you know that the British just did this because, well, he was obviously black. However, you can actually see him in this picture as a trumpet player for the 1511 Westminster tournament. So there was literal proof of him being in the UK at that point. I'm sorry if I keep saying UK, I mean Britain. I just keep getting confused. So 40 years later in the future was actually when the first group of Africans did arrive to the UK, and as I said, they were brought by John Locke. 3 of them, we luckily do know their names. I can't pronounce the one. I don't know if it's Bine, Binner. I literally do not know how to pronounce it. I'm so sorry, but I will insert on the screen. As well as Anthony and George, and I really do think it's important that we remember those names. These names, however, we don't know if they were their real names or adopted names, and on top of that, we also don't know the names of the other 2 that were enslaved by John Locke and brought to Britain. But do let it be known that these were still borrowed slaves, and the English didn't even start trafficking slaves for another 8 years. So this was all actually going on under the woodwork. Not really a lot of people knew about it, but it soon became a pretty big thing. Not only did we steal them from their families, but we also didn't pay them, which is why I say they were borrowed. And also, I just hate using that word, and I just want to say sorry for it because it makes them sound like a property. Throughout the whole of this video, you're going to hear Africans be referred to as property. I'll get into it a lot later in this video, but I just want to put a disclaimer that I obviously do not see Africans or black people or any person of colour or any human for that matter as anybody's property or possession. The idea in the beginning was for them to learn English, and then they could go over back to Africa and translate for us. They could be our interpreters, however, they would work for us, but yet again, not get paid. 3 of them were then taken by William Towerson, who was a London trader who also captured slaves on his voyages from Plymouth to Africa between 1556 and 1557. Once they were captured and spent a little bit of time in Britain, they were then taken back to Africa to persuade fellow Africans to join the journey, promising them that it was safe to board the ships. Now, I can just confirm it definitely wasn't, and you know for a fact that these Africans were forced to say it, otherwise their lives were pretty much at stake. So here began the cycle of slavery before slavery was actually a thing. Another disclaimer, this is obviously happening in other countries, possibly before, possibly after, but this is the British history that I'm teaching in this video, so that is not to say that this didn't happen before either. From these trips, multiple books and transcripts were actually written, being surprised at how much warmth and affection Africans were showing. Like, imagine actually being shocked at humans behaving like humans. It's baffling to me. In these books, it also stated, for example, that Ethiopians had no noses, no tongue or upper lip. And one of these myths sadly stuck, and a lot of people read it and believed it. It was something so minute. It was just that Africans were fish eaters because they lived by the shore and they would capture their fish and obviously eat it. I mean, that's the whole point of catching a fish. And at first you really don't think it's that bad, hearing what I've just said. However, the way the book worded it painted Africans out to be lazy and that they didn't put much work into anything and they just had it given to them. So reading it word for word, it says that Africans were utterly free from care because they always were sure to have plenty of food. English people then elaborated that notion to say that Africans were completely not hardworking, carefree, lazy, and that is sadly where a lot of the assumptions come from. And this myth had elaborated so tremendously that the English then made an ethnocentric generalization for all Africans across the sea that they'd never even met before, painting them out to be lazy. This then gave white supremacists the perfect excuse for the slave trade, even though, may I just add, it wasn't fucking true, obviously. Like, they're humans, okay? But that's the myth that Britain, along with America and many other countries, made up to make themselves feel better about what they're about to do. Sadly, from this, no remorse was shown when the slave trade was happening, and it just kept snowballing and snowballing. More generalizations, more myths, and they all contributed. This meant that there was no remorse buying humans, kidnapping them in most cases, pretty much all the cases, branding them with the owner's initials or company who actually stole them in the first place, whipping them, raping them, abusing them, forcing them to birth their own children of their rapists, shipping them and selling them to the New World, forcing them to do unpaid work and whipping them if they refused. Or, do you know what, not even refusing. They whipped them for literally anything. It's fucking ridiculous. The conclusion that I've actually came to is that authors birthed racism, but the British people raised it. We elaborated it so much that it became the new normal. So moving into the 1560s, we have John Hawkins, who was officially the first Englishman to trade in Africans. He made a total of 3 voyages to Sierra Leone, and he actually captured 1,200 inhabitants of what we like to now call the Dominican Republic and Haiti. He then sells them to the Spanish in exchange for pearls, sugar, ginger, and Queen Elizabeth I actually provided him with the ship in order to do all of this. So even our own royalty was in on all of this. Knowing all this information, you'd think that the slave trade was already a thing, but it wasn't. It actually didn't officially happen until 100 years later, although it did still happen, and that's why this video is so important. It needs to be known that slavery was a thing way before it was officially a thing. From 1570, Africans were forced to work in 3 different capacities. The majority would be household servants or maids, and we do see this quite often in TV and cinema quite frequently. However, they would also be forced to be prostitutes for English and Dutch men. On top of that, they were also court entertainers, and toward the end of the 16th century, it became the norm to have at least 1 or 2 black Africans in your household working for you for free. So just for a quick moment, I'm going to take a break from English history because I feel like this is such an important thing to mention. Again, I will do a whole separate video on American history, but it is really worth mentioning in this video. So the Black Holocaust is something that is still going on to this day, although a lot of people do deny it, and I know a lot of you are probably thinking the only Holocaust that you are aware of, the mass murder of European Jews in Nazi Germany during the Second World War. However, the word Holocaust actually means any mass slaughter or reckless destruction of life. So the Black Holocaust actually began in the 1600s, and that's the reason I'm mentioning it now, because it fits into the timeline. There are sadly many Holocausts that have actually taken place, but the 2 similarities between the Jewish Holocaust and the Black Holocaust are as follows. Now I'm going to be reading this from a screen because there are a lot. Forced marches and migrations. So for example, thousands and thousands of enslaved Africans would be forced to walk thousands of miles to the seashore in order to make the trip. They then would have to take a boat to the islands of the New World that they were being forced to travel to. So this was forced migration. However, sadly, so many didn't make it because of the conditions they were forced to be put into. On top of this, you had stolen property, dehumanization, slave labor, mass incarceration, torture, medical experimentation, which is also a whole different branch, race riots, lynchings, which infuriates me that it's still a thing and they're trying to pass it off as suicide. Again, separate topic. Mass murder and long-lasting psychological effects, which is now what psychologists called PTSD, but back then they didn't know what that was. So during the Black Holocaust, 10 to 12 million Africans, men, women, children, grandmothers, grandfathers, were all kidnapped from their homes. As I said, they were then forced to march 1,000 miles to the seashore without breaks, and then once they got there, they were kept in an underground dungeon for up to a year before they even departed to the New World. This part can be quite disturbing for some viewers, so if you want to skip like 10 to 15 seconds ahead, would advise. So on these ships, the people would sadly be piled on top of one another in that formation as cargo, and there was 54,000 ships that went on these voyages. They were usually shackled by their feet and hands and bound together so that they can't move, and they were forced to lie in each other's feces, sick and urine because they couldn't get off the ship and they weren't allowed out of the cargo space. This lasted between 60 and 120 days because that's how long the voyages would take to land. So this was the forced migration that I previously referred to. Once they arrived in America, they would be forced to partake in a slave market, which was basically an auction for people. Buyers were there to invest in however many slaves they would like per household, or if they wanted them to go to a plantation. And these people were treated so horribly. They were literally treated like cattle, being poked, prodded, their mouths pried open, and some, even children, would be forced to strip down naked in front of mass crowds to inspect them for defects. Let me again just remind you that these are actual people. So this is your frequent reminder that these are literal human beings. They're your friends, they're your family, they're your brothers, your sisters. It's fucking sickening. We will carry on. You will have frequent reminders of that. I'm sorry, I just literally can't believe these people, before they were sold and once they were sold, were treated like a possession and property of whoever owned them. Children were sold away from their family and would never see them again. And on top of this, in America, they had slave codes which actually made this legal. This would outline the acceptable treatment and the rules that slave owners would be able to abide by. And although these varied from state to state, they were pretty common codes that had similarities in each state. You'd think that these codes would actually benefit those people who were enslaved, benefit their healthcare, benefit their rights. However, if anything, it just stripped all of that away, and it just made life extremely more harder because it was legal to treat them with such insanity. There was a few common rules, such as one could not do business with a slave without prior consent of the owner, therefore treating a human as property of somebody else that can't be touched by anybody else. Slaves could be awarded as prizes in raffles, and if you went gambling, you could actually win a slave, and they were also transported as gifts to a friend. A slave was not permitted to carry a gun, even though it was legal, and if you were found with a gun, you would receive 39 lashes. I'm not going to insert any photos because they are horrifically graphic, and I'm sure a lot of you know what slashings look like. You can only imagine the damage that would cause. It's horrific. In the court of law, if there was a crime against a white person, blacks were actually classed as insufficient. They weren't allowed in a jury because their views were not important. The education of any slave was prohibited, stopping them from learning anything. This was even so strict that some didn't know how to talk properly apart from certain commands. They weren't allowed to learn to read. There's actually some really good examples of this in films. I've watched 12 Years a Slave, not properly, but just a little few segments, and within it the woman of the house hands the slave a shopping list, says to go get the ingredients, and the African man turns around and says, okay, that's completely fine, and she's taken back because it means he's able to read. The fact that you weren't even allowed to read, you weren't taught to read, you weren't taught anything, you weren't taught numbers, words, all of your rights were completely stripped away. Like, we have so many privileges in our lives, I don't even think you guys watching this realize. We have access to free education, and we also have the access to the internet, such as me reading all this, learning about all of this, books. They didn't have that. They didn't have any rights at all. To continue on from that, if you were found teaching any of the enslaved Africans anything at all, this was specifically in Missouri, you could be punished with a fine of up to $500, which was a ton of money back then, and face up to 6 months in jail just for trying to teach someone what they have the right to learn. It's so infuriating. Marriages between slaves were not considered legally binding, so if you already had a family and you were married, you would be torn apart. Any slave found guilty of arson, rape of a white woman, or conspiracy to rebel against the slavery was put to death. However, let me just explain to you that if it was a white man that did any of this, it wasn't a problem back then. Slave women were referred to as chattel or chattel, I don't know how to pronounce it, and this translates to personal possession. So if a white man was to break into your plantation and rape a slave, the only thing that they could be guilty of is trespassing. They wouldn't get done for the rape or sometimes even murder of the enslaved Africans. Sadly, not many cases were reported because who the fuck are you supposed to tell? Like, literally everyone's against you. Now on top of this, if you didn't think that was bad enough, they actually had fugitive slave laws, which is where if someone ran away or even enslaving free black Africans, you could do that. For example, if you were black and you were born and raised in Britain, you could also be enslaved and it was legal. You didn't have to be forcefully migrated into Britain. You were born here and you were black, you could also be forced into slavery. So if we think about it, there were 8 generations of Africans. They were born, grew up and died being enslaved. You're probably wondering what they did when they were enslaved, and there was things called plantations. Your plantation could literally be anything, but it was always hard work labor. As soon as the sun came up to even past when the sun went down, you would be working. You'd have no pay for 6 and sometimes even 7 days a week. You were frequently whipped and suffered horrific punishments, literally just for being black. Again, you were not allowed to read, write, you weren't allowed to learn anything at this time. They were poorly fed, poorly housed and poorly clothed. If you had a daughter, sister or a wife, they were more than likely raped, and you can only imagine there was no hope for the end of this horrific suffering. So there's a little bit of good news, but it is very backhanded. So the 13th Amendment was brought in 1865, and this completely outlawed slavery in America, but it wasn't actually completely outlawed. 4 million former slaves were actually put back into slave labor, completely unpaid, and they became sharecroppers on the old plantations that they were forced to work on. However, sharecropping isn't actually what I was referring to. If you've watched 13th on Netflix, you'll know all about incarceration laws in America and forced labor again. Most importantly, you'll know about unfair bails and the repercussions of not paying your bail, which nobody can pay their bail in America because their sets are ridiculously high if you're a person of color. I'm going to do a whole separate video on that because it's quite frankly ridiculous, but it's also really interesting how the US government quite literally created a new form of slavery and made it legal again. But to roughly summarize for any of you that aren't aware or haven't seen 13th, which do really encourage you to do so. Anybody convicted of a crime after 1865, which is when the 13th Amendment was put in place, could be leased out by the state to a private corporation or business. They would extract their labor for no pay. It would basically be like they're serving their time wisely in prison. No. As a private organization, they weren't under any obligation to provide any healthcare or any care at all for their workers. I'm sure a lot of you know about the healthcare in America. So the individuals that they were exploiting was basically just reverting back to slavery. And let me just tell you, the people that are incarcerated unfairly is majority black Americans, and their bail funds are set so ridiculously high so they can't pay their bail that they will just have to do this forced labor. They will have to be incarcerated even when they haven't committed committed a crime. Some crimes back in the day used to be if you failed to step off a curb to let a white man walk past, you would be incarcerated, and your bail fund would be set at millions, meaning you literally wouldn't get out of prison because you, your family, absolutely nobody can pay that, and you would be forced to do the labour that the prisons force you to do. Although you can't call it slavery because, well, it was abolished, wasn't it? Fucking wasn't. So these prisoners are watched over all day consistently with guns quite literally at their backs, and if they step out of line, they get shot. The elite prisoners, which I didn't even know was a thing, but there are elite prisoners such as white prisoners. They're basically there to just keep the black prisoners in line, or Hispanic prisoners, or anyone of a minority for that matter. However, this does mainly happen to black incarcerated males, and through coercion or violence, they would force the rules upon them. And if you didn't want to agree to this prison slavery and you didn't want to take part of it, you would literally be sent to solitary confinement. There's no windows, completely black room, no one to talk to, you're in a cell by yourself. It's hell on earth. So many people have lost their lives from going clinically insane from being in solitary confinement, and it's something you just would never wish upon anybody. So to recap that, just imagine you've been forcefully put in prison for a crime that you didn't commit, or it was such a minor crime, could be up to 10 years, could be over, depending on how the court feels on that day. Your bail fund is set to a ridiculous amount that you, your family, and quite frankly no bail funds of any state could afford to bail you out with. You're then forced to work with little to no pay, no health care, no actual care of your human sanity for companies and organisations that quite frankly don't give a shit about you. You're then beat up and bullied just for the colour of your skin, or if you just refuse to do what they're telling you to do, because why the fuck would you want to do that? If you say you don't want to do it, you're put into what I would call a mental hellhole and driven insane. So you either deal with the prison slavery or you get sent to your death in solitary confinement mentally. Both not very good options at all. So that just wasn't back in the day. That wasn't just back in the 1800s. That still goes on now to this day in America, and it's fucking horrifying. The fact that they can get away with it is just ridiculous, but then you do have to remember that slavery was legal once, so they can get away with it because they're in charge. White people are in power. There are still companies to this day, mass companies, who we all know and quite a few of us do love. I will admit I do love one of them, but I don't anymore, who use prison labour, and these include Victoria's Secret, Whole Foods, McDonald's, Starbucks. Man, fuck McDonald's. They're big names, man. And I bet you didn't even know that watching. A lot of us don't know that. I won't go too much into it now because I know this is British history, but just please watch 13th. It explains all of that. I don't need to be repeating the words of black people because it's all there. The resource is there. Please go watch it. But I'd just like to bring that to your attention, that slavery in the US still exists. I'm gonna leave that here, and I'm gonna leave the whole video here because we are moving into a whole different segment. So in the next video we're going to be looking at the 1600s. So thank you so much for tuning into this video. If you've watched it to the end, thank you for listening. I know for some of you finish university or school like me. I've just finished my university degree and you probably don't want to be learning about anything right now, but it is so crucial that you do. This shit should have been instilled in us while we were at school, and it wasn't. We get taught the whitewash version of history. Really important that you keep up to date with these videos. None of the money that I make from these videos is going to go into my own pocket. I will be donating it because I just feel horrifically weird about profiting off black history like us white people have always done. So the revenue of this video is going to be donated to some bail funds. I'm going to leave some in the description if you guys want to donate as well, because from the last segment it is so important that bail funds are even raised for the people who were wrongly accused and falsely incarcerated, and for the people that have committed minor crimes but are spending their life in prison. I'm also going to leave some petitions in the description for some cases that I've been reading about recently of people that are literally facing life in prison for the stupidest of things. So on that horrendous note, I'm going to love and leave you. Again, thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you go do some further research. This weekend's task for you all is to watch 13th, and do leave some comments down below if I've missed anything out of that timeline. I just want this platform to be educational from now on, and this video be a source of education as well. If you guys have any great resources, leave them down below. Any great petitions. I love you all so much. Stay safe, look after yourself, and I will see you in the next video. Boom.